Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. You'll also find our archives, where you can listen to every episode we've ever done going back to 2006. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is December 19th, 2012, and my guest is Morten Jerven of Simon Fraser University and the author of Poor Numbers: How We Are Misled by African Development Statistics and What to Do About It, which will be published this spring. Morten, welcome to EconTalk.
Thank you very much, Russ.
Before we begin, I want to mention this is scheduled to be the first release of 2013, which means that 2012 is over by the time you hear this. And I'd like to get some feedback from you out there in the listening audience. Please send me an email listing your 3 favorite episodes of EconTalk for 2012. You can find all the 2012 episodes, as well as all of our previous episodes, going back to 2006, at econtalk.org. Just look at the menu on the left-hand side of the page, and you'll see the archive there, organized by date, category, or featured guest. So look up 2012's podcasts, and send me an email at mail@econtalk.org. And in the subject line, say favorites. And give me your 3 favorites, and I'll talk about them on air, I hope. And I'll tweet on them at EconTalker, which is my Twitter name. Now for today's guest, Morten Jerven. Morten, your book is a fascinating and, I have to say, somewhat depressing look at the quality of data in national income accounting and other areas of data collection at the national level, but particularly in Africa, which is the focus of your book. What's the main problem with calculating GDP or growth rates in Africa? Why is that so difficult? And why has it been so inaccurate?
Well, the main problem when compiling GDP estimates at the statistical offices in most African economies is that of data availability. These departments who are putting together the national accounts, which produces the GDP estimates, have very little information about the economy they are supposed to create a measure of. And in particular, they may have very little information about food production. They may have more information about export crops. They know a little bit about some manufacturing, some of the larger operators. They know about government activities, but there are huge gaps in the information relating to what we call the informal sector or the unrecorded economy. And moreover, this problem of reaching a reliable or valid GDP estimates is not varies considerably from country to country, and it also varies considerably across time. Some countries have very little data, some countries have more data, and if you look through history as well, this problem has varied with intensity since the 1950s. And that's basically what my book is about, to try to map how serious these errors are and how they vary and what to do about it.
And these are data that are being used typically, I mean, they're used for all kinds of reasons. They're used for trying to determine how much aid to give. They're measures of internal value to the country, but they're often used by economists in the development field to assess whether certain policies are working or not working, or whether certain nations are at least making progress or not making progress. And when you say they differ, these estimates vary by time and space, meaning across country and even within a country across time. That's very disturbing for the people who are running sophisticated statistical models trying to assess the effectiveness of various policies, right?
That's right. So let me just talk through a couple of examples or debates where GDP statistics are particularly important. One is, for instance, whether a country is ranked as a poor or a middle-income poor country according to the World Bank. If it is ranked as a poor country, such as Tanzania and and Kenya are, then it's eligible for concessional lending through the IDA, the concessional lending arm of the World Bank. If it is a middle-income country, it is not eligible for that kind of lending. And to take a recent example, it was when in Ghana, when they redid their GDP estimates, they recently found out that their economy was almost double the size of what they previously thought and previously published, so that suddenly the Ghanaian economy was ranked as a middle-income country and is no longer eligible for concessional lending, whereas other countries which have not updated their GDP statistics, we would hesitate to compare Ghana with Tanzania or Nigeria or Kenya today, and particularly it makes a mockery of those kind of rankings when we recently seen, and as I describe in the book, how vulnerable these statistics are. But there are other also, as you refer to, as more sophisticated econometric analysis using this data. And I think perhaps the most famous debate for those who have been interested in African economic development for some time is that about whether structural adjustment programs, or rather the liberalization programs, which was implemented in sub-Saharan African economies almost without exceptions from the 1980s, 1990s. And then the big debate was whether, this was supposed to spur growth, to make growth recover. And the big debates have always been, try to compare strong reformers to modest reformers, and then try to tease out an average GDP growth effect. Now, when we know how big the underlying unreliability of these data series are, we know there is enough error in there to make these kind of analysis completely, not trustworthy.
I hear you soften it. Yeah, completely meaningless is what you meant to say. But I like not trustworthy is very polite. I like that.
Yeah, and the third example, I think, which is now one which is resurfacing as one of the most important questions for those who are interested in how the poorest in the world are faring at the moment, and that is that of trying to get what we refer to as elasticities between these measures. So, to what extent is recent growth causing a reduction in poverty, for instance? And when we look at papers written on that, trying to calculate these relationships between recent GDP growth and recent reduction or increases in poverty, and these models are unfortunately way more sophisticated than the underlying databases does allow.
Yeah, so you're trying to tease out the effect of liberalization on poverty, and using this chain of causation. Liberalization ideally leads to higher growth, which should lead to less poverty. But you have your two data sets that you're looking at, the two observations on GDP and on poverty, are so mismeasured you really don't know what you're getting.
That's right. And there is also, I think, in the book, I try to suggest one distinction between talking about data as valid versus data as reliable. Valid, when then talking about the GDP measure, would be the question whether the GDP estimate is correct. Does it capture the economy 100%? Now we know that a GDP measure of the US economy, the German economy, the Norwegian economy would never be correct. There will always be a little bit of some data which is, there will be some cheating, there will be some data which are questionable, but we know we are more or less within bounds of what is, a couple of percentage off here and there. And so that would be the question of validity. As we've seen from recent events in Ghana and also forthcoming events in Nigeria, the validity question is really huge in sub-Saharan Africa. We're talking about plus minus 50 to 100% on GDP levels. This would maybe not be a problem if you were interested in change, as we were talking about now, what one type of change has a causal effect on another, such as GDP, liberalization, and poverty. The problem is if you have the measure, the validity of the measure changes through time. So that would be if you equated this with your bathroom scale at home. It wouldn't be such a big problem if your personal scale was off a pound or two, if you were basically just interested in measuring yourself on a weekly basis to see if you're gaining or losing. The problem comes in is that of reliability, and that is if someone changes your scale in the middle of the night, and therefore you have a scale which shows have an error in a different direction, and there you will have serious problems about talking about a time series or change over time. Another problem is, of course, validity does still remain with us, even if the data was reliable, in that if you started comparing your own weight with that of the neighbor who used a different scale, then you would still be very, very, very difficult to determine who's the heaviest or lightest.
When you talked about Ghana, I couldn't help thinking of my great-grandmother, who at one point, her town was in Russia, and then because of some border changes, I think related to World War I, her town was moved, could have been before that, she found herself in Poland.
Mm.
And the joke was, thank God, no more Russian winters. and I think about that when you think about Ghana. So you're saying they woke up one day and they found out they were twice as rich as they thought they were. And I guess in one dimension, that's a good thing, I suppose. In another, you'd say, well, it really doesn't matter. It's like the Russian winter joke. If it snows a lot and it's cold, who cares what you call it? If you have a lot of money and you're living pretty well, who cares whether it's measured as rich or poor? But as you point out, there are a lot of reasons that leaders of nations, particularly, and sometimes citizens, care about how things are measured and classified. And in particular, I would have thought coming into this book, before I read your book, I would have thought, well, one of the problems of GDP measurement in every society, as you talk about in the book, is the informal sector, the underground sector, the non-market sector, the non-monetary, the home sector, as it's called. There's all kinds of things going on that aren't measured, either because they're hidden or because they're simply not measured. There's no dollar value you can put onto them. And you give the classic example in the book of the person marrying his cook. You marry your cook. If your cook's a woman, you're a man. You marry your cook. The cook's activity used to be part of GDP, and now it's not, because presumably she's not charging you for the meal she makes at home, at least in a monetary way.
Mm-hmm.
So I understand that, and I thought, well, okay, so GDP in Africa is probably underestimated, but it's underestimated by sometimes an enormous amount, which is what is so surprising. Explain why. What are some of you mentioned a little bit, but let's go into a little more depth. Why is it that it's one thing to, like you say, it's one thing to say, well, we didn't get it exactly right, but they're not even in the ballpark. And you suggest that sometimes it's incentives that are causing that. What's going on?
Well, it's a nice little anecdote to introduce this question with, because one way of thinking about this is it's about boundaries or borders, and this we're talking about here is what was referred to often as the production boundary, to decide what type of economic activity should be included, accounted for, and which should not be included. And as in the book, I provide a history of how African economies have been measured from colonial times until today. And one of the things that is particularly striking is how the views on production boundary does change through time. Now, so one of the reasons why you could start thinking about, okay, maybe one should not include any non-monetary activities or those which are not recorded. But that would be, as you say, would render the GDP estimates completely meaningless, because there's so big part of the economy which takes part in this sector, and we know it's so economically important, so we need to include it. Another thing which is a good argument for why one should try to attempt an exhaustive measure is that one would get an artificial measure of growth as some economic activity travels from informal into formal activity if you don't have a proper baseline estimate to begin with. But to answer that question about why there is so much economic activity outside the production boundary, one of this is you have to look at the structure of African economies. And I make the point in the book that this is, of course, not having inaccurate statistics is not, solely an African a problem relating to African economies. But I argue there are reasons why we think this problem is particularly large in sub-Saharan Africa. One is that relating to the activity and the capacity of African states to collect information on its inhabitants. Usually, this kind of the collection of having a population census, having a population registry, registry of businesses, it has been related historically across the globe through the evolution or the formation of states, and also the evolution of taxation systems. In sub-Saharan Africa, historically, land has been more abundant. Taxes have not been collected on private property to the extent it has been elsewhere. And that's meant that states have been more typically collecting information and taxes at borders, at ports, so that Frederick Cooper talks about African states as gatekeeper states. And this means that the states in Africa, on average, have less information about what goes on in their, and less information about what goes on in their domestic economy, but also less incentive to collect that information. And this is that's one type of more static structural characteristic. The other one, which I point out is as well, is that African economies was subject to a much deeper economic recession, or at least a more heavier economic shock in the 1980s. So when, of course, the petroleum crisis and the interest rate hikes which followed in the 1980s, which led to economic crisis in Latin America as well, and stagnation across in the world economy, was hitting African economies particularly hard, and it also hit them. It hit already weak states particularly hard, so that budgets which were allocating funds for statistical offices were particularly constrained. Moreover, it also there was this double challenge in that states, on average, before 1980s in Africa, were more engaged in organizing directly involved in production. They were also directly involved in transportation of goods. They were engaged in buying and selling of food products through their marketing boards. And basically, before in the 60s and the 70s, African states had more what we call administrative data which they collected on their day-to-day basis. Post-1980, post-structural adjustment, these states have increasingly been liberalized and therefore have access to less administrative data, and also have less incentive to collect this kind of information.
So basically, one of the things that's going on is that the size of the unmeasured sector is changing radically over this time period. So you can't just sort of assume, as I think most people do about the United States, which would also be false, by the way, that, we don't count household production. We don't count the meals that a husband or wife cook for the family. But that's okay because it's kind of constant. But of course, there have been radical changes in household production in the United States over the last 40 or 50 years. Year to year, the changes are small. Decade to decade, the changes are big, even in the United States. Yep. Certainly in Africa, they're enormous. So the other part I'd like you to talk about is that the attempt to try to measure these unmeasurable sectors using proxies like rainfall or cement production, I found that tragicomic. It's unbelievable that that's what people are doing to try to estimate GDP. So talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. So let's return to, what I started to describe at the beginning, about why there are problems of when you start aggregating GDP. So if you are a national accountant and your task is to aggregate GDP, you find yourself having some problems reaching the total sum. For those there might be readers who are not that familiar with national accounting, so it might be just worthwhile going through the different ways of arriving at GDP.
I would say very few of our listeners are familiar with it. So yeah, talk about that a little bit. How would you? In theory, it's pretty straightforward. You just take the dollar value of everything people make and sell. It's straightforward.
Yeah,
goods and services. Just add them all up.
That's right. So that's the theory behind it. When it actually goes on in practice, it gets a bit more complicated. The system of national accounts, as it was designed by Richard Stone and then later approved by the OECD and different committees about how to do things, the United Nations have published 3 versions of the system of national accounts about how this should be done according to an international standard. And the system is that you should reach GDP in 3 ways independently, so that you have. So what you say, it's just about adding up what people produce or consume, and then get a sum. More systematically, that means there is the expenditure approach, which is the standard Keynesian identity, that GDP equals consumption plus investment and plus government, and then plus minus export and imports. So that should seem pretty straightforward. You just need to have the data on what the government does. You need to have some data of capital formation, investment. You have exports, you have imports, but then you come to consumption, which is the big unknown, which means, which in the absence of a fairly accurate and reliable household budget survey, you simply do not know that share. So in practice, consumption is always arrived at as a residual. So this approach does not have the information. You don't have the information in a statistical office in sub-Saharan Africa to arrive at this measure independently. The other approach which is a little bit out of fashion, is that of deriving from political economy, that of added together wages, profits, and rents, which would be the old way of thinking that GDP equals what everyone earns in the end. So it's just about the receipts of GDP. That would be the income approach. Because again, large part of the economy do not really receive a formal wage, but are rather small-scale independent operators who have a very unpredictable wage earning and pays themselves a wage when they can.
And barter is barter.
Yeah, different ways of getting by. Even if you had data on this, it would be recall data and it would be difficult to compute. So usually this is also not, this statistic is not, this approach to GDP is not calculated. What you do have is that of the production approach, which means basically you go through the familiar industrial tables where you have agriculture at the top, then you have mining, you have manufacturing, you have electricity and water, construction. Then you reach the different service sectors such as retail, wholesale, transportation, hotels, restaurants, and then you arrive at the government, their expenditures on different types of services, administration, defense, education, and health services, and then the big voluntary social services category where you would put NGOs and churches and so forth at the end of the table. Now, so then that's the way in which GDP is arrived at, is to try to go through this table and do the best you can per sector.
So where's it get tough?
It does get tough already in the first category because in the agricultural sector, you have very good data or quite good data on how much agricultural goods are exported.
And that's because they go out through a port where people are trying to measure them for government purposes, so that we have some, of course there's smuggling, but put that to the side, we have some idea of exports.
That's right. So this, and there has been an incentive from colonial times to collect this data accurately, particularly when it was taxed. To take one example, in Uganda, which is a landlocked economy, for those who do not know, behind it, it's at Lake Victoria, behind Kenya and Tanzania, at the equator in Central East Africa. Uganda collected their trade statistics in Mombasa, which is the port town in Kenya. So that would be a classic example of how the knowledge of the state was limited to particularly the port and the trade statistics. So you have fairly good statistics there, but you don't have statistics on the full production. So there you will have to use a proxy. Typically, what statistical offices did in the 1960s when they started to aggregate these estimates was to rely on advice from the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome, FAO, about what would be the reasonable per capita estimate for a country in their income bracket, and then simply multiply that with their estimate of the rural population and rural population growth.
So that's kind of horrifying because you're kind of assuming your answer. You're trying to figure out how much income people have. So you start by assuming what it is and then attributing some calorie consumption amount to that and then adding it to another thing you can't estimate very well, which is population.
That's right.
Bad.
So it's bad practice. It is done in order to reach the total sum, to have the GDP aggregate. The problem becomes when people use these series in order to econometrically estimate other results.
Yeah, I'm reminded, sorry to tell another joke, but I'm reminded of the guy someone gives him $100 in $1 bills. So he's counting to see whether he actually gave him $100. He gets 53, 54, 60, 65, 70, 73, 74, and he says, well, if it's right this far, it's probably right the rest of the way. And so, it's kind of like, well, I estimated some of this stuff correctly. I'll just kind of get up to the total without, it's bizarre. But there are three main data series that econometricians use. The estimates of Angus Madison, the World Development Institute, and the Penn World Tables. I've seen all these data many, many times myself. It's not my area. Yeah. But I was shocked to see them all in one place, because what you usually see is somebody say, well, I've used the Penn World Tables for my analysis. And I think, well, that's a reliable source. Then you see that they don't agree so much. And we're not talking about, well, they're off by 1 or 2%. They're big differences.
No, it's when I did this exercise myself, I was quite surprised, I must say. And it came about to me as a thought experiment, listening to particularly these papers where someone found that some type of historical variable, such as type of colonization, the engagement in slave trade, legal institutions at independence, was causally related to GDP per capita.
Yeah, I've seen those.
Today, there are famous papers about how history matters for development. Yep. Basically, but that means you have to kind of trust the income distribution of African economies today. So you have to kind of think that, okay, so, those economies that are poor today or among the 10 poorest are also among the 10 poorest, give or take a couple of years, and also across data sets. And I asked someone when I heard one of these papers, and I sat in the audience, I said, have you checked whether this is, robust to using different data sets? And they said that they did, but I didn't trust them, so I went home and did the exercise myself.
Oh, you're very naughty. Shame on you.
Yeah.
You skeptic.
Yeah, absolutely. And and what I did, and this is part of my book. It's also for readers who are interested. It's also, I did an earlier exercise like that, was published in the African Affairs in 2010, where basically I took the GDP per capita estimate in year 2000 for all sub-Saharan African economies, according to the Madison dataset, according to the World Development Indicator dataset, and the Penwell tables, and just, they use slightly different international prices, how they harmonize the data and so forth, different calculation behind it. But what I was interested in was simply, how do they rank the African economies? Is there a difference in ranking? And what I found is that these data sets for year 2000, they agree upon the ranking of one country and one country alone. And that is Democratic Republic of Congo, which everyone agrees upon is the poorest country in sub-Saharan Africa.
Okay. So we know something. It's good.
Yeah. And then
maybe. Anyway, at least they agree.
Yeah, they agree upon that. It's also widely agreed upon that, that's probably the GDP estimate, which has, is that GDP, which is the most poorly estimated in all of sub-Saharan Africa as well, showing that if you have little data, you also tend to produce an underestimate. But then I looked through the rest of I ended up with 45 countries, because not all of the data sets have countries for the same countries, such as Madison groups Eritrea and Ethiopia as one country and so forth like that. So I ended up with 45 countries, and for the remaining 44, they did not agree on the ranking of any of these countries. And this was not the ranking being off with the 1 or 2 spots. It was serious things, such as the Penwell tables thought that Liberia was the second poorest country in sub-Saharan Africa, whereas Madison thought it was among the 10 richest. Slight difference. And other countries such as Nigeria, Guinea, Mozambique, other countries travel a lot. And in fact, the standard deviation in ranking, if I recollect this correctly, was 7 ranks up and down. And my basic exercise from that was to drive that basically, when we are looking at these rankings of GDP per capita, we should approach this, in 2010 I thought, give or take 30% would be the correct reliability as band. Today, it's been shown by the recent GDP revision in Ghana that we might be thinking plus or minus 50, 75% on this. And this means that for all practical purposes, all those kind of econometric estimations are meaningless.
Yeah, totally meaningless.
It doesn't, and that does not even, I should make this point. Most criticism of the use of the GDP estimates is about, GDP is not the correct measure. We should be looking at other things. We should be looking at literacy and so forth like this. My critique is that, fine, yeah, there might be problems with the GDP estimate, but exactly how good is this particular data is the subject of this book. And I show that there is something wrong with the metric itself. Not only that it does not capture the right things, but
so one of the things that if you ask me for to give a stylized fact about world development over the last 20 years, sort of what's the consensus? I would have said the consensus is that there's been tremendous growth over the last 20 years, particularly in a lot of it's in China and India, which is somewhat misleading because they're very large. So they can pull up the average. But the world overall is there are many, many fewer people living at less than $1 a day, less than $2 a day. And again, you could broadly say this is due to liberalization. Both China and India have opened their countries to more market-based forces. So this confirms my biases, I have to confess.
Yep.
So I like that. And then I say, well, but people say, but the one continent, the one part of the world that hasn't participated in growth is Africa. Africa's been stagnant over the last 20 years. And then you say, well, that's because they have bad institutions. They don't have rule of law. There's a lot of corruption. They don't trade much. There's a lot of protectionism. But what you're suggesting is that, I'm going to go a little further maybe than you want to, and you correct me, but what you're suggesting is that actually Africa might be doing pretty well. It's very hard to know, but because we have so much aid going to Africa out of the total amount of aid from the United States, from the World Bank, from the IMF, from Europe, that it's in the interest of African leaders to look stagnant and to look poor. And maybe they aren't.
I wouldn't go as...
I think you would, but go ahead. No. Give me a reaction.
I wouldn't go as... I think I almost agree with you until the last sentence. So I wouldn't go as far as... Let's talk about those other things, and then let's talk about incentives for political leaders at the very end. Because I think there is some interesting... When you start looking upon the history about... Because what we're talking about here is basically to reconcile time series data. So how did African economies, looking at singular economies, but also on the regional basis, how have they performed over the past 2 decades? How did they perform over these past 2 decades as compared to the 3 decades before that? That's the kind of debates we're thinking about. And which time periods were they lagging behind Asia? Which periods were they lagging behind Latin America? When were they ahead? When did they perform better, and so forth? And I think there's a couple of striking things coming out of that. And one is that I do, in the one example I would like to pull out is one which relates to what we said about proxies earlier in the conversation. And I would like to emphasize it, to tell a little bit about this, how GDP growth has been estimated in Tanzania.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Because Tanzania is, it's an interesting country because it's been fairly well governed and so forth, but it's also special in that it was a country from independence, particularly from the late 60s into the 70s, was also, grouped under what we call African socialism. So it was a socialist country in which the state was heavily involved in large part of the economy, also trading, transporting goods, and so forth. And until the 1980s, the GDP estimates were made, actually until the 1990s, the GDP series was made to assume that if the formal economy, that is the recorded economy, was in decline, so was the informal economy. So that was an assumption of proportionality. Yeah. So that if food production as recorded went down, then we also think that food production not recorded also went down. When the World Bank and technical advisors went in the 1990s to rebase the GDP series, they made the opposite assumption. They then changed the assumption about how to use the proxies, and then assumed that when the formal economy was in decline, then the informal or the unrecorded economy would be growing. Now,
could be true. Both those things could be true.
Absolutely.
Right? We don't know which one it is, or both over different periods of time, but both those are imaginably true, that there's either that they move in tandem or they move in opposite directions because of crowding out, and yeah.
Absolutely. And it's exactly what's the answer to that question is maybe the question which, has attracted the most interest in development economics. This is related to how to interpret went first surplus models, the classic Smithian models about what happens to the rest of the economy when there is an observable export growth. What happens, when there is unlimited supply of labor? How does the other unrecorded sector? So forth. These are big academic, scholarly questions, if you like. But what's very interesting about this case is that this question was settled at the statistical office, and it was settled differently before and after 1987. if you start looking at the resulting GDP series, what suddenly happened when they rebased the series was a suddenly recovery of growth when they changed the assumptions. So that means that we must take care when we try to think about to what extent have. So the question what I put forward is in the case of Tanzania, for instance, the extent of economic decline was overestimated in the 1980s, and the corollary would be that economic growth recovery in the 1990s, following liberalization, was overestimated. So that means, to the extent that we can generalize from the Tanzanian case, and I think one has to be careful about looking at country per country basis here, we might be very careful about celebrating and applauding the recent growth we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa. A second point, which is interesting to make when it comes to the literature on African economic growth, is not only have they ignored the problems of the GDP series, but they've also been perhaps a bit too pessimistic, as you allude to. One interesting thing is that we know that the Economist had their famous special issue or front page in the year 2000, calling Africa the hopeless continent. That was in the year 2000. The bestseller, perhaps, on African economic growth would be The Bottom Billion, I think, by Paul Collier, published in 2007.
Interviewed on this program, sure.
Yeah, and which is a very interesting book. But it is perhaps surprising to look back at that and look at the GDP series, which tells you that African economies have been growing very rapidly, indeed as quickly as other places in the world, since the mid-1990s, and somehow it took economists a decade and a half to notice it.
Yeah.
Which is and meanwhile, I think there is what happened but that's a separate argument which I don't make in this book, which I made elsewhere, is that I think that to some extent the governance deficit, if you like, in sub-Saharan Africa has been overemphasized, and we have been very, very good at. Right now, economists and political scientists are very good at explaining why African economies are not growing, while in fact they are, which is an interesting knowledge problem.
Yeah, fascinating.
But there is also, relating again, how much should we trust these measures? I think a lot of the record high growth coming out, for instance, such as in Ghana now and Nigeria to come, should be taken with a serious, with a small bucket of salt, because a lot of this sudden growth is coming by including previously unrecorded economy.
Right. So you really have no idea. You don't have, the bottom line is you don't have a benchmark that's
right.
reliable. And so as a result, your rates of change are not reliable. As you say, if your another way to say it is if your methodology is changing, you can't really compare the past to the future of the present.
And then it should also, some of the basic caveats with regards to interpreting African economic growth needs to be taken as well, not only those related to statistics, but I think the World Economic Outlook just published their projections, and in there you see that. Well, I can ask you, what do you think is projected to be the fastest growing economy next year, Russ?
In the world?
In the world.
China.
No, Southern Sudan.
Of course. Why? Why?
They will. Their GDP growth rate next year is projected to be 60%.
It's a good year.
Yeah. Then the next follow-up question is, which do you think was the slowest growing economy this year in the world?
Ireland. Greece.
No, it was Southern Sudan again. If I remember this correctly, their economy contracted by about 50% this year.
Well, thank goodness it was only a 1-year contraction. It's going to bounce right back.
For Southern Sudan, this is about whether they're allowed to turn on the pipeline with oil or not, of course. So, here is where sometimes petroleum export growth and so forth matters more than statistics. So I mean, one of the things that drives recent economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa is the undisputable rise in exports. How that relates to economic growth in the domestic economy and on the African continent is a question we are very, very poorly equipped to answer because of the measurements problems. That's what I wanted to.
I mean, you're kind of preaching to the choir here, because as longtime listeners know, I'm very skeptical about econometric analysis for different reasons than we've talked about today. I'm skeptical because sometimes aggregation is, I think, has methodological problems, or there are too many things we can't measure that we need to measure. I think you quote Einstein. What is it? Not everything that counts that can be measured. Not everything we can measure counts. And so I think a lot of times econometricians and economists doing applied statistical work are just, they take whatever they got and they throw it into a data set, and they see what's correlated with whatever else is in there, and then they find a story to tell. And there's a lot of ex post storytelling, but this is a whole new level, right? You're basically saying that we're really fooling ourselves. And so the next, we've got a little time left. The obvious question is, well, what do we do? What do we do now? And I'm reminded of the story that Nassim Taleb tells, which I love, which is, a bunch of people are lost. They're trying to drive from, this is not the way he tells it, but it's the same point. They're trying to drive from Washington to D.C. to New York, and they're struggling. They're lost. They're off the main road. And finally one of them says, "Oh, good news. I just found a map." And, "Oh, thank goodness, a map. Unfortunately, it's a map of Paris." But somebody says, "Well, that's okay. Some map is better than no map." And that's a common argument you hear. It's better to have flawed numbers than no. I mean, if you don't have any numbers, you can't say anything. Mm-hmm. But I would argue it's better to say something that's true than something that is unknowably true or maybe false. What do you think? Where do you think this leaves us? In other words, what do we know, if anything, that's reliable? And what might be done, you talk about this in the book, to make it better?
Yeah, no, I think that's a very fair question. And I think it also, the answer depends very much who I'm talking to. One is those which are, academics and scholars. How should they proceed when they conduct their next analysis? How can they be immune to these kind of measurement problems, if you like? Another thing is, so that would be the data users, which there are expert users, but there is also less expert users, such as headlines in announcing this and that about economic growth in sub-Saharan Africa or elsewhere. But there is also that group of what to do now. Question should also be addressed when it comes to the data disseminators. That means, for instance, then the World Bank, who is the big data bank and publishing this data. What should they do in order to inform their data users? And I think it's also important not to forget, which I try to, my main reason for writing this is not only to inform data users, but also to map out a way in which this problem can be remedied for those economies which we're talking about. So that means actually a state's ability to have some, the word statistics, refers to the state. Having a valid GDP measure is basically the state knowing something about themselves. So I think there is some important questions regarding data production on the national level as well. So let me begin with data users. I think data users, I hope after they read this book or heard this podcast, that they will not take a GDP ranking according to GDP per capita ranking of African economies seriously anymore, and start questioning. The fact of the matter is that to compare GDP per capita as the official estimates you can download from the World Bank from Ghana and that of Nigeria today is completely meaningless. and the data will change for Nigeria next year quite a bit. So that means that's a direct implication there. The other is if you run your regressions, if you're so inclined, then you have to take these kind of error margins seriously and start thinking about using other physical data where you have, export volumes and so forth to try to think about, am I actually doing the right thing here? It's an interesting thing, which I talk a little bit about in the book as well, that there has been a change in how data users inform themselves. I think development economists in the past tended to be much more writing country books and monographs about countries, being an expert on an area and so forth, while there has been a trend, particularly in the 1990s, and still with us, although a lot of this is going into the randomized evaluations type of literature, there is still more economists now relying on cross-country regressions than there used to be, because of obvious reasons.
What are those obvious reasons?
Well, there's obvious reasons. One of them is the availability of a computer.
Yeah, okay, good. That's scary.
and the other obvious reason is, or actually one of the main reasons, is the very availability of these data sets which I am discussing.
Yeah.
So when these things have been downloadable on the fingertips, it's been easier to do research on causes of economic development from your office.
Yeah.
Which means that mistakes will be made, so that people do make mistakes when they analyze growth recovery in Tanzania, because they don't know the changes in the underlying data series. So that simply means that scholarly users needs to take one extra effort and actually do like historians do. And that means, what's the source of this evidence? What's the provenance? How good is this data? How did it come about? And so forth. Do some serious source criticism. When it comes to disseminating of data, as I talked about, these are interlinked processes. But let's think about the World Development Indicators, for instance, where you can download, all of these data, or you look at the Millennium Development Goal reports, where you have these big data sheets which are just filled out. And you have data on all the economies, and they seeming to be one observation is comparable with the other. I think there is time for these, for World Bank and other data disseminators to start labeling their product correctly. That means that there should be a double star on those data which are actually not data, but are just projections. And there should be a product declaration which tells you that actually in Ghana, they just revised their GDP series, so their level estimate is probably quite reliable, whereas that GDP estimates, which we here published side by side for Nigeria, has not been revised since the year 1990 and is probably off with about 100%. So that means more metadata or information about the data. When it comes to actually doing something about it, then we need to make a shift again to start realizing that this is about national statistical offices in different capitals and regions in sub-Saharan Africa.
And you've spent time there, by the way. Although you do spend time in your office, and you probably have a computer, you also have, you talk in the book about, you ask people in these offices that were often run down and bedraggled and beat up, and I think derelict was one word you used.
Yeah.
You've asked them, what's going on here? And they often bravely do the best they can to defend their work, but often they confess to you that a lot of what they were doing is not very reliable. Yeah. And so you've gotten your hands dirty in some sense in the field.
Yeah, I should. We didn't touch upon that, but I should emphasize that this book is the culminating result of work I've done by conducting interviews and collecting data, information about GDP estimation in sub-Saharan Africa since 2007. And I have visited, particularly the research is based on visits to Accra, Ghana, Abuja, Nigeria, Kampala, Uganda, Nairobi, in Kenya, Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, Lilongwe, in Malawi, and also in Lusaka, Zambia, and Gaborone in Botswana.
And I just going to mention, good luck in the highlights there. We'll do the best we can to get those spelled correctly. Go ahead, carry on.
I've also conducted a survey-wide telephone and email interview with the statistical officers. And why my emphasis has been to be on the side of to try to figure out what are the challenges being faced by the local statistical office. And I think that's also something that happened, and that's part of a historical explanation, is that, from the provisions of the United Nations Statistical Office and the legal provisions therein, this is data that the GDP estimates, among other data, was supposed to be submitted annually to the United Nations, and then they would submit it and disseminate it through their bodies. So it was state data. At some point in the 70s, African economies, among others, were getting more and more delayed and were not able to provide these statistics because of the problems we talked about earlier in the show. And gradually, World Bank and IMF started producing their own data, to the extent that, when I give this paper and present my work, people are surprised that these GDP data are actually national statistical data. They wouldn't trust this data if they knew they were collected there. The brand name IMF or the World Bank is better. But so my book is an effort to try to think about that when you are quoting a GDP statistic on Democratic Republic of Congo and Kinshasa, then you are actually making a statement about how reliable you think data coming from that office is. And that means we need to think about how we can strengthen those offices that are in need of support, which is a considerable challenge, which I write a lot about in my book, but maybe we don't have time to talk fully about here today.
Right, we only have a few minutes, but I just want to add, it has crossed my mind at various times, because I am not any longer much of an empirical economist. In my youth, I ran regressions like all good economists. I learned how to use a data package. But as I've gotten older, I've gotten more interested in what I think of as narrative economics, try to help people understand how the world works, and less concerned about how to measure with any precision the connections between things. I think it's enough just to show people that there are connections, since most people miss those anyway.
Yeah.
But having said that, so again, I'm not a consumer of that or producer of those data, but in the United States, we're talking about Africa, but the United States, I view a lot of data that gets produced by the government as being misleading or often, quote, wrong. I think the data on inequality, which is household-based, is distorted by demographic change. The GDP numbers, they're in the ballpark, as you say. The errors are probably in the 1% to 3% range, which most years they're probably similar, so it's probably not so bad. But it's funny, you talk about the asterisks. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that the stimulus package, at one point they estimated that the stimulus package of 2009 had created anywhere between 500,000 and 3 million jobs. Now, at least they gave the range, right? They didn't just give us the number, but they should have had an asterisk to say that this was not an estimate of the actual number of jobs created the way the average human being would estimate it. They had run a set of regressions and basically done a set of projections based on the amount of money being spent by the stimulus package and holding constant the impact of dollars of government spending on employment that had held in the past, which weren't the structural system that we were currently operating under. And how you can call that a measure of the effect of the stimulus is beyond me, yet many, many, many mainstream economists will quote the CBO as showing that a nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office found the stimulus worked. Well, they didn't. They didn't do the analysis. And they confess it. They say so. They even say when they report those estimates, they don't put an asterisk, but they do have a paragraph, if you find it, that says these don't look at actual data that occurred after the stimulus was passed, but rather looks at data that was before and then projects it forward as if that were the impact. And that's intellectually bankrupt as far as I'm concerned. So you could argue, and I'll let you close on this, you could argue that we don't really want to improve these numbers. It's inherently always going to be politicized, misinterpreted, and even when you're trying to do the kind of analysis you're talking about, which is comparing, say, structural changes and their impact, so many other things are changing, you're going to end up doing something that's probably not so reliable anyway. So tell me why we ought to be worried about this. Tell me why we ought to fix it. And I'll let you, I've been the cynic, so you can close on a more uplifting note.
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer to that challenge.
And you can bring in what you didn't answer before when I said that there was this incentive of leaders to distort the numbers downward because they want to keep collecting the money. So you're going to have to answer that too, because that's part of the problem. Even if they have the better statistical office in societies where trust and rule of law are not so established, they're going to be distorted maybe anyway, even after you improve those offices.
Mm. I think it's important that we first clarify, as you suggest, the political incentive to tamper with numbers. And I think what we've seen, for instance, with the upward revision in Ghana and the forthcoming and pending upward revision in Nigeria, which do take these countries into middle income poor country status, as was part of their political leaders' promises. Actually, in Ghana, they delivered on their promise 3 years ahead of schedule, which is quite something. And they will now, Nigeria as well, will probably become a bigger economy than South Africa, and therefore have more sway, for instance, to negotiate for a seat in different UN legislative bodies or others. But I think that when it comes to, so there is some leaders do want to show some evidence about doing better, and then some of them have increasingly turned their head to the statistical office and say, hey, maybe we're not estimating GDP correctly. Maybe we can get a different type of estimate if we update the data series, which is what will happen now in Nigeria, and Nigeria will become much richer than we thought it was. I think the relationship of the incentive there should not be interpreted that directly, the other way around, so that there are leaders who on purpose let their country look poorer or more stagnant than it should be, and therefore don't update their statistics. I think those leaders who are not really interested in economic growth per se is not really interested in GDP statistics either.
Fair enough. Good point.
So it just doesn't enter the calculus. But I think there are others. Then I think on these, then GDP, I should emphasize as well, is for me just an analytical angle and window in to looking at the statistical systems in these countries. And it is important because it is the sum of all the activities of the statistical office and also the most widely used indicator for economic development. But underlying this data is all, as we talked about, different sectoral estimates, having a population census, being able to say whether inflation is at 10% or 120%. Those kind of statistics is also needed in order to reach that final aggregate. And there are other places where this does apply, particularly in food production. We know very well that governments have been likely to have some incentive to overstate the type of food shortfall in order to qualify for financial aid, and also when financial aid is forthcoming, as this, for instance, has been in. I discussed the case of Malawi in the book, where Malawi for some years now have been overstating food production very, very seriously in order to say, hey, keep on giving us funds in order to subsidize maize, corn fertilizers for maize production, because they're really, really working to the extent that Malawi at this moment should either Malawians should be gaining weight quite rapidly, or they should be exporting a lot of maize, but neither is happening. So the statistics must be wrong. I think those numbers do matter, and there are incentives to tamper with them each way, and so it's important to be aware of this problem, so that we don't, as you talked about from the US situation, treat these numbers as facts just because they are published by an official body. So that means that just not using the numbers that are convenient, but try to analyze what's behind them. That being said, I think there is a case for really working towards finding a strategy to which we can get better numbers and better data for African economies. And that means that I said we have to reshift our focus to realizing that these are not data that are collected in Washington, D.C. They're actually collected in the countryside in Tanzania, in the countryside in Ghana, or elsewhere. And that's where we need to think about what is needed. There has been a tendency, as I talked about, towards the agenda in development being determined on a global basis, and therefore also the data collection agendas are also been determined as that the statistical offices just have to kind of fill in the gaps in the global data sheet, rather than being able to determine what is their own statistical priority. So that means it's quite interesting to see that most leaders going to elections, for instance, Jakaya Kikwete in Tanzania 2 years ago, went for in the election campaign, trying to be elected on the basis of that he promised to improve employment. And it's an interesting case that there has not been a labor survey in Tanzania for a very, very long time, in the 1980s, as far as I know. And there is simply no measure whether, what extent is the unemployment number. And there is no way of saying to Jakaya Kikwete, unemployment went up or down or so forth when he's going to face re-election down the road. So that means the point I'm making is that at least, Ross, you have some numbers to quibble with. There is a debate about the CPI, the unemployment, the employment effects. There is a debate about to what extent is the performance indicators on the US economy capturing GDP growth. There is a debate about whether inequality is correctly measured or not. But in many of these countries, the statistical priority is not determined within the country. It is very often determined from outside donors providing ad hoc funding for particular projects needing to prove their policies elsewhere, and therefore data not being collected for the state itself, and therefore not fostering that kind of debate, which is a public, creating a public record in which trust and distrust is exchanged, and there is a political debate about whether politicians are doing what they promised, whether projects are delivering what they promised, and therefore fostering that type of political systems, which we refer to as accountable, where there is accountability, good governance, and so forth. And I think the Statistical Office have sadly been neglected, severely neglected, I should say, when it comes to developing agendas for better accountability and better governance in the future for African economies. So I think that's what my book hopes to reignite.
My guest today has been Morten Jerven. Morten, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you very much.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.